Okay, and I've even remembered the captions this time, which I usually forget, which is good. I'll be getting into trouble from you, Anna. Right then, so we're on number 7 session of the Northern Digital Storytelling Festival 2023. We've been trucking through our sessions this week. There's been some really exciting and interesting talks throughout the entire week, which hopefully, if you haven't a chance to see them in the flesh or on Zoom, so to speak, go to the website northerndigifest.co.uk, and in the tab at the top there'll be session recordings, so go and check out there the other sessions. There's been all sorts of fun and exciting things, but today we're going to talk about the role of the narrator, and we're being joined by Anna Bramwell-Dicks and Lucy Hammond from Pilot. Anna's from the University of York, but also is it a visiting fellow for XR Stories?
Research fellow. But
research fellow, that's right, yeah. I'll get it right when I do your intro, but I'm just winging it at the moment. So the format for today, as I'll do a little bit of an intro, and then we're going to have 2 15-minute talks from Anna and Lucy around the topic, and then we'll do a bit of Q&A at the end. Now, we've had three session speakers for most of the sessions, which is why it's been an hour and a half, but today, because we've got 2, we may cut it a little bit shorter, so don't panic if we finish a little bit early, which just means you can have an extra cup of tea at lunchtime. So our festival is designed to be accessible to all, free to attend. We're both live online for Q&A here, but we're also available afterwards with the recorded content. We've curated a programme of people right at the top of their game, working in cutting edge ways, willing to share their experiences in support of the North's creative industry. So a massive welcome to you guys, and really thanks for taking the time. I know how busy you both are, flying around, jet set into Poland and America and all over the place. So I do appreciate you taking the time to come today. I'd like to also thank the Screen Industries Growth Network, who have funded the festival. So without you guys, we wouldn't be able to run this. So many thanks to you. Check out Sign's website. It's really cool. And they're actually running a skills festival, I think, a skills event today and possibly tomorrow as well. So it's all go over at Sign. Anyway, let's get cracking. So are you okay to go first, Lucy? Yeah, okay, cool. So I'm going to introduce Lucy. Lucy Hammond is a producer at Pilot Theatre and creative producer director, where she works with immersive technology and virtual reality in particular. Her projects Monoliths, Traitor and The Archive have all toured internationally and have been shown at several prestigious festivals, including Tribeca Film Festival, Melbourne International Film Festival, BFI London Film Festival, where she was nominated for Best Immersive Artwork 2022, and Sheffield DocFest. When the audience is at the centre of the action in VR, what is the role of the narrator? Pilot Theatre's projects have looked at the role of the narrator in different ways, placing the audience at the heart of the story, as well as embedding the narrator into the soundscape. In this session, Lucy will talk through the successes and failures of each approach. Okay, over to you, Lucy.
Brilliant. I'll never get used to that intro. It feels like it's like an out-of-body experience every time it happens. I'm like, who's Heather talking about?
You did all. In fact, you did more than that. I just haven't been up to speed with the latest stuff. I'll need to add it again.
Oh my gosh, every time. Okay, right. I'm just going to see if I can make this big. How can I do that? Annoyingly, here we are. Perfect. So yes, thank you for that lovely introduction. I thought today I would again talk through, I did a session at the beginning of the week that sort of looked at the idea of digital storytelling through some of Pilot's projects, because I feel like quite often sort of working through case studies is a really great jumping off point to kind of understand the lens of how we as a team have looked at certain aspects of the role of the narrator. So I'm going to look at the role of the narrator through 2 pilot projects, that both of which Heather mentioned. The first one is Traitor VR, and then the second is Monoliths, which is our most recent project that's been touring. So Traitor VR is was a really interesting and exciting experience for us to work on. It started life as a live theatre show, where a group of audience members broke into a building after dark, and after a hacker who had some files, and we were meant to, as the audience, sort of traverse this building following the story, and had a decision to make at the end. the show was really well received and it was really well attended, particularly by teenage boys, which is really interesting for a theatre production. And an opportunity arose where the Lighthouse in Brighton were doing a sort of residency with artists that hadn't previously worked in immersive, to sort of give them a toolkit to look at bringing to life immersive projects out of what they were already doing in their creative practice. So we applied and attended this, myself and artistic director Esther Richardson. Out of that, I sort of was really inspired by the idea of VR, not necessarily in this case as totally immersive medium, but actually as an opportunity to create a space within a space, so that the VR headset became a space within a space. So what this turned out as was an experience that happened in one room that took sort of similar structures from that original theatrical storytelling. And it meant that two players played at once, and there was a live actor in the room who played the role of Commander Harris. You can see a little bit of Harris's script here on the screen. And one person wears a VR headset, the other person doesn't. And the person in the room has a control desk, which you can see, that's the lower image, a close-up of the control desk, which used Arduino to connect to the VR. And then the person in VR had tasks to complete as well. And without the other wouldn't work. So they had to communicate to push the story forward. So in terms of the narrator, this is where it gets quite interesting, because we sort of created an environment, and at the time this wasn't necessarily, we weren't thinking about the narrator at the forefront of this storytelling, but through the development of the project, it became really clear that actually the key narrator for this story were the two players themselves, and they built their own idea of the narrative together through the clues and the breadcrumbs that we gave to them via Commander Harris as a character, through some of the video we showed them, through the VR tasks. And I think that that's particularly exciting. So this here is the opening sequence when Commander Harris meets the trainees, we called them in the story. We cast the players as trainees for the Digital Espionage Division. And this was all part of the setup. And I think that it's important to note this, because I think in order to have a successful experience where the audience become their own sort of narrative within the story, have their own narrative, that they are given the confidence to feel like they are slightly removed from themselves. And this was a really sort of interesting method that we used to onboard them. And it took a lot of development, actually. And we worked with a really great team of collaborators to sort of work through this. The writer for this piece is Richard Herford, who wrote the original theatre play. And it was a sort of completely new adaptation in a way. And then we worked with a brilliant interactive experience maker called Rachel Briscoe, who works with Fast Familiar as well, and then a wider team of collaborators. So the narrator, the next, this is Emma, who gives you little tidbits of the story in Traitor the Experience. So this is where it gets interesting. So this is actually on the left here, a section from the script for Traitor VR. As you can see, there are sort of descriptions of what's happening in the VR world, and then the control desk sort of section. And then the audience, they complete that task and they get a phone call on a phone in the room, and a voice says this little bit of text. The phone goes dead and Commander Harris enters. On the right is a still from an original pitch showing Commander Harris, but in the actual experience, it was played by several different people at different times. I think this was for us was a really interesting and crucial moment, this decision that happens after this phone call. And this, I think, is where the narrative element for the audience really sparks off. So as you can see, the real Commander Harris, our actor, enters and asks the two players any progress yet in finding these files that they think have gone missing. And the players have a choice at this moment. And this is the first time in the narrative during the experience where the players have an opportunity to tell the truth or lie to the actor in the room. And this throughout performances was a really interesting moment, in that quite often two strangers are playing together and they get very little time and very little sort of verbal communication to be able to understand if they're going to both lie or both tell the truth or both say something different. And so it created this really interesting splinter of the role of the narrator in this story, because at this point they decide to curate their own experience basically and become the narrator of this story themselves. So when they're telling this story later about their experience in Traitor, this decision is really crucial in how the future of the storytelling continues for them. So quite often they would lie to Commander Harris, but some people would be truthful, and the actor would be trained with 2 different responses, depending on whether they had response A or response B. And this was also a really bonding moment for the audience, because as I said, they had to either decide to work together truthfully at this point, or to be sort of opposed to each other in their beliefs about what they wanted with the narrative. So I wanted to sort of highlight this moment in red as a really crucial moment. And this didn't come easily to us in the development of the project. Deciding how these decisions for the audience would be made was quite a complex and in-depth workshop process for us. Something as simple as this looks like it should have come easily, but actually the consequences of this decision are really important, and this comes quite early on in the half-an-hour experience that Traitor runs for. So talking of consequences, when the experience ends, the 2 players do have to make a very interesting decision about these files. Do they release them to the public, or do they give them back to Commander Harris, who works with the DED? At this moment, the technician in the room hands one of these cards. Actually, the technician only has the blue card and Commander Harris has the red card. So there's 2 different endings. And so I'm sort of putting this here to illustrate that the audience is sort of own narration of their experience throughout this. There are moments when they're alone and Commander Harris isn't there, when they're deciding what to do. It does have consequences, and therefore the narrator for this story is fully embedded in the audience's experience. And at the end, a different group could have had a completely different idea of how that narrative has worked, and will then tell the story of their experience of Traitor in a very different way. And so there truthfully is a 2 decisions here, and the way it ends would be different depending on how you as a team have worked together and how you as a team have interpreted the different clues and information that you've received through the game. So this is a little extract from a review of Traitor from the immersive magazine No Proscenium. And I thought this was particularly interesting because in this, Catherine Yu, the journalist, is doing 2 things which I thought felt like are kind of putting the role of the narrator on the audience. It feels like it sort of proved it to me that had sort of been successful, because if you see this line, will you stall, will you give up Emma, will you tell the truth or hide it? I feel that all that language really places the audience with agency at the center of the story, and they, at the end, and including in this review, feel like they personally have had that narrative experience and have influenced that. And we haven't fed the narrative to them with one single voice throughout. They are the single voice in a way. They are the core of that experience for themselves. And similarly, the last sentence, I'm proud of our actions and I believe we did the right thing. I think that language is really interesting, where it really does feel like there was agency there for the audience and for the reviewer. And I thought I'd just highlight this as an example of a moment of triumph for us as a creative team, where we felt like someone had come away feeling like they were at the heart of the story. So yes, that was Traitor, and I'd be really interested in any sort of questions around that later. But I now want to talk about a very different experience really briefly, Monoliths, which is 3 poems set in 3 locations in the northern landscape with magic realist environments sort of animated. These environments were built by One-to-One Development Trust. Andy Campbell and Judy Elston are amazing artists. Please look them up, they're brilliant. This is the bus through Bradford. This is the moorscape. and this is the Northeast Coast. And in each of those, you hear the voice of a different narrator. And they were 3 separate commissions about that particular writer's relationship with that particular landscape. And what was really interesting about this is they are a disembodied voice combined with a 360-degree landscape. So completely different to Traitor. The audience is given the narrator's voice in each different environment, and those are very carefully choreographed to the animation that is available in the visuals. And this had a really interesting effect, because I was worried, compared to my previous projects, where it really does place the audience with some agency at the center of the story, what this might mean for the audience experience. But interestingly, because the poems are so beautifully formed and feel sort of like little capsules themselves with each environment, each narrative voice does take the audience on a journey. And lots of the feedback we received from the people that have done this VR experience is that through hearing the voice of that person, rather than feel like it was their story, they were starting to sort of immerse themselves in the environment and the voice and the sort of poetic descriptions that were present in the landscape, and sort of stitch their own narratives onto that. So many people felt like in the moorscape, someone had equated it. They were imagining themselves, they were from Wiltshire, and they thought it was a little bit like going to Stonehenge for them. And they were starting to sort of build their own narratives around this. But I think what is particularly important about Monoliths is that actually in this, the narrative voice is the story and is the core of the experience. It's all about celebrating the Northern accent and Northern women, and we have 3 very different accents in this experience. And I feel like having that direct vocal quality from the writer themselves is a really big part of what we hope is a sort of magical and transformative experience for people. It's a very important aspect of the storytelling for Monoliths, and very different to Traitor, even though that each person has their own sort of narrative they take away at the end of this experience in terms of how they felt about the landscapes. The poems themselves are there to be immersed in, and the vocal quality of those people and those narrators makes the experience what it is. Without them, they would be beautiful environments, but the sort of poetic magic of the journey just wouldn't exist. So I have one more thing to say about the narrator, which is in Monoliths, we work with a really great composer called Mei Chi. And our discussions with her in the creative process were really interesting, because in Monoliths, there is a kind of spirit guide that takes you from place to place. And it's in the form of a stargazing hare, which obviously is in folklore such a magical creature. And what we discussed was that there was this sort of 4th voice outside of the three poets. And that was the score. And the score was the voice of the hare. And I think that that's a really interesting way of also thinking about narration, is that sometimes it can be the human voice that narrates your story, but there can be this whole other layer where the voice of this hare, the magical hare, is sort of layered on top and continues to be your spirit guide throughout. And that felt like a really sort of important pull through across all of the three stories in Monoliths. So I wanted to put that out there as a sort of more abstract and interesting way of thinking about narration and immersive and digital storytelling. So I feel like I've talked a lot. Thank you so much for listening. These are my contact details. I'm happy for you to get in touch if you have any questions after this session, but I'll hand over now to my other esteemed presenter, Anna. I hope that was great. Thank you.
That was brilliant. Thank you very much, Lucy. Amazing, as always. You can come back. Okay, I will introduce Anna next then, and then we'll have some Q&A at the end. Okay, so Anna joined the School of Arts and Creative Technologies as an associate lecturer in interactive media in September 2015. She is currently module convener for the programme of digital media and app design and app development modules on the interactive media BSc, as well as systems design for sound and image on the film and TV production BSc. Anna is also a research fellow for XR Stories. Anna's going to talk about the role of a narrator in terms of the narrator's role is to present a perspective that shapes how the audience understands and interprets the story being told. But how do different approaches to narration affect audience understanding? In this session, Anna will talk about a research project, Destigmatizing Disability in Future Stories, where she is exploring how different approaches to narration, or lack thereof, can influence an audience's understanding of disability and the potential for increased stigma if these stories are not told appropriately. Over to you, Anna.
Okay, great. I'm going to do that thing where I share my screen and hope it works. Ooh.
Yeah, cool.
Oh, hang on. Please install the Zoom audio device. Hang on a second. Hopefully that won't take long. Can you hear me? It's saying my microphone isn't working. Okay, well, we'll just ignore that. Is it sharing the right?
I can hear you fine, yeah.
It might be that I've got a video that has audio in it and we might not be able to hear that, but we'll gloss over that when we get there. Right, okay, so thank you for taking time out of your day to come to this session. I'm going to start by introducing myself a little bit and then get on to considering how a narrator can be used to control audiences' perception of a story with some examples from my own research. So given it's Zoom and my face is probably quite small on your screen right now, this is a photo of me taken last week in Texas at South by Southwest, where I was presenting my research. I didn't buy that cowboy hat, and that is my biggest regret of the trip. Anyway, so my primary research interests are around disability access and disability representation. And you might be wondering how this aligns with a session on digital storytelling and particularly on narration, but I promise that it does. Hopefully all of this will become clear as I go through this presentation. So while my focus is on access and representation, I'm particularly interested in how those topics work within entertainment media and using new technologies, looking at different storytelling formats from traditional media like literature, film and television into more immersive formats, including augmented and virtual reality. So to that end, you can probably change the title of my part of this session to The Role of Narrator in Destigmatizing Disability in Future Stories. Before I get on to thinking about narration in stories about marginalized communities, I think it's useful to maybe go back to some of the basics about narration specifically, and to kind of make sure that we're kind of all on the same page about what we're talking about when we talk about narration. So what is narration? Well, it can be defined quite simply as written or spoken commentary that's used to convey a story to an audience. So in written storytelling formats like novels and short stories, narration is pretty much required. You can't really have a written story without some form of narration. But in other formats, so film, video games, TV and plays, the use of narration as a storytelling construct is more optional. So this is because in these formats, there are other ways you can convey the story to the audience. So you might have visual action or dialogue instead. And that can be used to take the place of narration. So given our focus on digital storytelling, unless we're thinking about kind of ebooks or audiobooks or text-based media like Twine, the writer is making a kind of explicit choice to use narration as a tool for exposition of the underlying story. Now, this is where this may or may not work. Is it going to? Let's see. Probably not. No, okay. Oh. Can you hear anything? Oh, it's played from the end, isn't it? Sorry, I can't see anyone on Zoom, so...
Yeah, we can hear it fine.
We can hear it. Okay, let's start from the start of the video then. Okay.
Chris wondered if Thomas was still alive somewhere. He wasn't going to go looking for him, but he did wonder, and that showed character. Probably. As the water began to rise, Claire vowed to save this little rectangle in as many restarts as it took. This would not do. John needed room to show off his exceptional skills. As it was, he was trapped on the wrong side of these little dot things. Chris was in love. She was perfect. He had to tell her so. Probably best to wait for a moment the large, ominous pixel cloud wasn't about, though. Yeah, probably best to wait.
Okay, so that was a video game called Thomas Was Alone. When I was planning this talk, I did want to include a kind of playthrough of me playing through Thomas Is Alone, but unfortunately, it's a little bit old and it doesn't run on my current Mac, which is kind of sad. So that was sort of a video taster of the game, but I think it really shows how the narration is used within that game experience. And I really like it as an example because I think it demonstrates the power of a narrator to add character, personality, and charm to something as simple as jumping squares. And without the narration, then that puzzle game might be quite fun, but you don't get as much of the story, and the audience's relationship to those simple graphics and characters would become completely different. Again, there we go. Right, so back to a little bit more theory. There are some different types of narrative voices, which depend on who is doing the storytelling and from what perspective they're coming. So in a first-person narrative, the narrator's telling their own story. So only they can see and experience it, and only they can provide us with insights into what's going on in their own world. So the first-person narrator is a powerful tool because that viewpoint becomes the only one that we, the audience, have to judge the events on the page or the events in the story. So the audience then believe that the narrator will be truthful usually, and believe that they're going to provide an accurate account of the story from their perspective. But there's also something known as the unreliable narrator, which is where the first person narrator has a viewpoint that's compromised in some way and provides a deceptive version of the story. So that's quite an interesting technique. In a second person narrative, the narrator's telling your story as the audience, which is a bit of a weird concept if you think about it. It's pretty unusual to find that in fiction. You more commonly see that in non-fiction, so like self-help books. Like I say, it's a slightly weird one, so I'm just going to gloss over it and get on to the two types of third-person narrative. So in a close third-person narrative, the narrator is taking on the role of a single character, or sometimes multiple characters for like different chapters or different sections of the piece. And they're telling the story from their point of view. So the third person close narration tells that story from a single character and provides insight into their worlds, but they don't have knowledge of the other characters' perspectives. So they're talking about the character by name, or he or she, or they, and they're using that perspective to convey the story. The final version is the omniscient third person narrator, which is this kind of all-seeing, all-knowing narrator who knows the characters in a lot of depth and exposes their backstories, their motivations, their emotional states, and their internal character to the audience. That's what we're seeing in the Thomas Is Alone example, that kind of omniscient third person version of narration. So now we've got a good understanding of the basics. I think it's a good time to jump into thinking about the messages that our stories leave audiences with and how these can influence perspective and understanding of different communities, particularly when thinking about groups such as disabled people. So let's get back to thinking about narration and storytelling in stories about disabled people and what message either we or they want the audience to receive. So you might be wondering why we should care about this. I argue that there's a problem with disability representation in current storytelling, and in fact that this is just really not a new problem. So poor representation of disabled people has been an issue in literature, film and TV for decades. Academics in media and disability studies fields have been writing about this issue for a long time. And back in 1969, Clarke proposed a model about the representation of minority groups within the media. So we've got non-recognition at the bottom level, where they're just not included in the media, ridicule where people are mocked, and that's an interesting level because potentially the group might feel a bit better because they're not being ignored anymore, but at the same time that ridicule can lead to lower self-esteem. Then we have the level known as regulation, which is where people with these marginalized characteristics are included, but only in kind of limited socially acceptable roles. And then the final level is one of respect, which is where we have a range of both positive and negative representation. So the representation is appropriate, but it's nuanced like human beings really are. So in 2018, Worrell stated that for disability representation specifically, most disabilities are kind of stuck at either level 1 or 2, with maybe a couple at level 3, but that's pretty rare. So you might be wondering why this matters, but there's actually a lot of evidence that this type of media portrayal leads directly to greater marginalization of people within minority communities through increased stigmatization and misunderstandings. So disabled people and those with chronic and mental illness have been asking for more appropriate representation in the media for decades. And while there have been some improvements, in particular, we see more disabled characters and disabled actors playing those disabled characters, there's still frequent issues with resorting to stereotypes, which have been shown to be harmful to people living with those conditions. So I'm briefly going to introduce these stereotypes using a framework that the Ford Foundation published in 2019. So the villain stereotype plays on people's kind of inherent discomfort with people who don't look the same as them. So the argument here that they're kind of showing is that disfigurement and disability makes the character revolting and morally wrong and reinforces the ideas that we should be afraid of people whose faces and bodies might be different to our own. So the example I've got here is from Wonder Woman, but the recent James Bond No Time to Die film features 3 villains, all of whom have facial disfigurement. And if you look at the history of Bond, most of the villains have facial disfigurement because that's how they indicate that someone is evil. We then have a stereotype that they call the super crip. This is a disabled character who triumphs over their disability. So at face value, this might seem positive. Who doesn't want to be seen as a hero? Daredevil overcomes his blindness to become this badass superhero who defeats the bad guys. So he's a superhero despite his disability. But this stereotype reinforces the idea that disability is something that has to be overcome. And we see the kind of super crip idea appearing a lot in something known as inspiration porn, because this is where people are portrayed as being inspirational by virtue of prevailing over their disability. Dr. Erin Pritchard once said to me that Ellie Simmons, who is the Paralympian who has dwarfism, she's obviously awesome and an amazing swimmer, but she's still a dwarf when she's in the pool and when she's out the pool. Her swimming ability and her success as a multiple gold medal winning Paralympian isn't about overcoming her disability, it's just about being an amazingly talented swimmer, and that's how we should be viewing it. The innocent fool stereotype is another pervasive one. Here, characters with intellectual disabilities are often portrayed as childlike, unable to make rational decisions for themselves, needing to be cared for by others. Forrest Gump is an example of this, and in Forrest Gump, it uses first-person narration throughout, telling the story from the perspective of Forrest as a disabled person. The final stereotype, the victim, is where you find disabled characters are often portrayed as kind of one-dimensional victims of their disability. Their disability becomes the defining feature, their lives revolve around it. Often movies like Me Before You or $1 Million Baby depict disability as a hurdle that's insurmountable and argue that, you know, a disabled life is not one that's worth living, and they present suicide as a better option. So these films are literally telling people that it's better to be dead than to exist in these types of bodies. The film Me Before You doesn't have a narrator, but it's an adaptation of a book. And in that book, it uses the omniscient third-person narration in the prologue And then it tells the rest of the story as a first-person narration, but as a first-person narration from the perspective of the non-disabled character in the rest of the book. So this is a book that's centered on disability. In academic circles, we refer to this as a narrative prosthesis, but this narration is not from the perspective of the character with a disability, it's from the non-disabled character, which I find quite interesting. So these are all big budget Hollywood films, not digital interactive stories. But I've chosen these examples because I think most people in the audience will be familiar with them. And also I think it helps to demonstrate the scale of the issue and that it's still a problem now. It does go far beyond these examples and into other media. So I'm going to kind of go quite quickly through the rest of this because I've already talked for far too long. If we take a really simplified viewpoint, traditionally stories can be considered told using passive media formats. So television and film, the creators are telling the story, they're in control of that. And the audience is separated from the story. So it's a kind of passive consumption format. That's a very simplified view, but that's what I'm going to kind of explain today. When it comes to games and more interactive formats, that onus of controlling the playthrough moves on to the player. So this allows for more opportunities for players to generate and interpret their own narratives based on the world they're playing in. If we think about virtual reality, we start thinking about concepts of embodiment, and there's evidence of something called a body ownership illusion, which is where the player understands they've become the character, not they're controlling the character. So this has the potential to be a problem because it allows us to start talking about ideas known as empathy tourism. So I've included a screenshot here of a website called Walk a Mile, which is where you can sign up to experience someone else's life in VR and literally walk a mile in their shoes. It's actually not real, it's a piece of design fiction, but you can see this as an idea that could start to happen. People could start to making these experiences. And actually, there are some academics who've done a wheelchair VR study, and they asked able-bodied people to use the wheelchair in VR, and they came away feeling the limitation of being tied to a wheelchair. But if you talk to wheelchair users, they don't feel that about their wheelchairs because the wheelchair is what gives them independence and freedom. So this has led to my current study looking at wheelchair VR. So we're creating a wheelchair VR experience with 3 different narrative perspectives. So the first has story narrated from first person using something known as the medical model of disability, which essentially argues or sort of puts the problem as being the disability. We've got a second version where the narration is also first person, but it's using what we call the social model of disability. So the problem, the reason that the wheelchair user can't reach the apples on the top shelf is not because they are disabled, it's because the environment is wrong. So the apples are too high. So it changes the perspective. And then in the final version, we've got no explicit narration. And what we're expecting is that the people in the no explicit narration condition will come away with an understanding of wheelchairs and wheelchair users that's closer to the medical model than to the social model. And that's not what wheelchair users say about their wheelchairs. So this quote from one participant who I interviewed before I started making this experience said, if you are within the context of having a body that isn't able, where you couldn't do those things without a chair, then the chair becomes freedom rather than restriction. And that's the message that we want people using the experiences to come away with, not a message that's focused around the wheelchair being a problem or the disability being the problem. And if I argue that if you ask someone who's not a wheelchair user to use a wheelchair in VR, unless the storytelling and the narrative is designed really carefully, they're likely to come away with the wrong message. So I'm going to just end by coming back to this slide. So when it comes to all formats of storytelling, the role of narrator is really important. In immersive stories, I argue 2 things. First, I fully support anyone who wants to tell their own story in whatever way they want to, but it needs to be clear that it's their own story and that it's not generalized to everyone who has that particular disability, because disability is nuanced. Second, instead of putting people in the position of playing experiences as a disabled person, it's much more powerful to create an experience where people are themselves, but they're listening to another character who is sharing their experience, or a narrator. So narration and storytelling are powerful tools, and when used well, they can really shape our understanding of the world and of people from marginalized communities. But in my view, this really needs to be approached really carefully and responsibly. Thank you. Sorry, I talked for way too long.
I don't think you did, actually. I don't think you did. No, I think that was fine. It was really interesting, actually. And, you know, it's something as well that unless you think about it, you don't think about it. Not, you know, it's not something that I really thought that deeply about. And I've got my best friend's in a wheelchair, and, you know, just as you were talking, just thinking about things from her perspective, you know, and you know, it does put a new light on things, actually. And especially if you're going to go into a situation where you're designing experiences, then, you know, having had that thought process, it brings it into your mind, and, you know, it's a really valuable thing. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm literally, my job is to think deeply about this right now. So I am spending a lot of time doing that.
That's good.
Yeah, thank you.
It's good that spoke out. Okay, so our best fan, Robbie, has already come in with a question. So we'll start with that one. So this is for you, Lucy. In what situation can narration be detrimental to telling a story? I assume that should be detrimental, not decremental. Is that right, Robbie?
This is a good question. I don't know, maybe Anna has some really interesting insights on this too, but I'd just say from my experience that my abstract idea of narration in terms of Traitor, actually, I think if we had forced a narrator on that story, I think that would have been detrimental to the experience of the audience, because it was very much about taking pieces of information and building your own narrative as an individual around how you would then make the decision at the end. So I think that if we had had a sort of overarching narration around that, then that would have been detrimental. I also think that that's just interesting to think about when you are placing. It's really interesting about what Anna's saying about the embodiment of the person receiving the experience and then listening to the narration. Who is that narrator? What is their relationship to you? Are you yourself in that experience or somebody else? And I think that not to say that the narrator is necessarily always going to be detrimental some places and not others, but I think that it's important that that's very carefully thought about in order for it not to be detrimental to the story. So that's just my contribution, but I'm sure Anna has some really great insight into it.
I mean, the only thing I think I'd add is that it's that thing about, in an interactive or edition environment, having a narrator is a choice. You don't have to have it. So you need to know why it's there. And if you know why it's there, then hopefully you're going to get away from the fact that it could be detrimental, because there's a reason why it's there. I think it becomes detrimental when the audience are kind of like, why is this person talking to me? You know, when you're playing video games and so, you know, narration also doesn't have to be audio, like it can be text on screen. And, you know, when you're playing those video games and it kind of does the bit and you're like, oh, skip, I don't want to read this. Like, that's when it starts to become detrimental. So it's sort of understanding why it's there and making sure it's used properly, because it doesn't have to be there. And so, yeah, I think that's what I would add.
And so Robbie's got one for you as well, Anna. How should we go about overcoming stereotypes? Nice little easy question for you there.
Oh, yeah. That's so I think one of the things about stereotypes is that there is sometimes an element of truth to them. The issue is when that is all we know about something. So that's when stereotypes become a problem, because that's what people immediately think when you think of, so for example, I'm autistic. The stereotype about autism is, you know, the Sheldon Cooper, you know, the autistic savant thing. I am not an autistic savant. I'm just an autistic person living my life. And so, but people sort of, when you say you're autistic, they think, oh my gosh, you must be wonderful at blah. And it's like, no, not really. I'm just a normal autistic person who finds it difficult to communicate with people sometimes. So that's when, you know, stereotypes become problems. I think in terms of overcoming them, what we just need representation that is authentic and nuanced and is not focused on those specific things, and that actually just is realistic. I've got a quote that I didn't include in that presentation, but that someone said on Twitter, and she lets me share it. And she's a disabled woman, and she said that she wants to watch a film where there's a disabled character who's evil. And the reason that they're evil is nothing to do with their disability. It's just that they're not a very nice person, because we're kind of fed up of that disability evil stereotype where you're evil because you're bitter about your disability. No, disabled people can be not nice people too, but that's what we want. We want authentic representation. So it's about kind of looking at how the stories are told and just being representative of a whole range of human experience, and not then pigeonholing into the stereotypes. You will then see still some of the stereotypes, but because they won't be the only message, it makes it, that's kind of fine at that point.
Cool. Okay, we've got another one from Robbie, but I'm going to answer that one, and I'm going to ask that one in a little second. So Catherine Crowley, sorry I was late, the internet signal here is dire. Do you have any European resources or open source resources for qualitative data? It would be good to read interviews and more insights from people who are disabled. Those of us not in academia or no longer in that zone are excluded from accessing such information unless we pay a fortune to read it. So do you have any suggestions for Catherine as to where she could maybe find that kind of information?
I don't off the top of my head, but I think it's a very good question. And Heather, could you email it to me, and then I will do some research, because I'm sure there are, but I just don't have it off the top of my head.
Okay, Catherine, are you happy for me to send Anna your email address, which I won't put on here, but I'd have in the back end of the website?
If not, I can send it to you, Heather, and you can forward it on. Is
that right? Okay, that's fine. Okay, Olivia, what level of sympathy, empathy should we aim to hit in stories? Do you want to start with that one, Lucy?
Well, yeah, I don't know. It depends on what the story is, doesn't it? And what your goals are, what message you want to convey to your audience through the characters. So, and that spans all types of storytelling. And I think there's, I'll sort of go from the angle of the parlance around virtual reality that's been quite sort of, for something people have trotted out for a long time about it being some kind of empathy machine or something. And it's like, I really feel that is a very boring way of thinking about virtual reality storytelling. A lot like Anna was talking about unreliable narrators, or like how it's just another tool to use. So I feel like, I think people will hear quite often that empathy is something with digital storytelling, with VR, that is meant to be some kind of, it's perfect for that. And I would actually argue that empathy is not the goal. It's not to put you in someone else's shoes, because even in Traitor, for instance, when we cast someone as another character, they are still themselves, really. So at the end, two people playing together, one might make the decision to give the files back to the government, but are they making that decision in the sense of empathy for the sort of people in the world in this story that will need to be protected from this, or are they doing it because they are enjoying the play element of the game and they want to do, you know what I mean? You can never know. But I think obviously sympathy and empathy are really important in storytelling when you've got some kind of emotional arc that you really want to hit with that particular character or set of characters. But I don't know. I don't think there is no true level. People can be completely despicable in stories and you have no empathy for them. Think about Succession. That's a really great example of that. They're all kind of despicable and yet we're fascinated. So I don't know, take of that what you will.
Yeah, that sounds great. Did you get anything to add, Anna?
I think sympathy is an interesting one. It can be quite patronizing, I think, particularly with disabled communities. So when I was at South by Southwest, I did a panel, and one of the people I worked with was this guy called Connor Scott Gardner, who is an absolutely amazing disability activist, and he's blind. And he was telling me a story, I'm sure he won't mind me sharing this, that he recently completed his master's, and at graduation, he went up on stage to collect his certificate. And he got what he and his family refer to as, quote, the blind clap, because he got the biggest applause of anybody at graduation simply because he's blind. And it's like, well, I mean, he did a degree like everybody else, and actually that's not what you want. Like, it's patronizing. It's really, really patronizing. So I think you can go too far on sympathy and empathy, particularly when we're talking about marginalized communities, because, you know, that's not what they want. They don't want you to pity them, like, you know. And again, that comes back to that kind of inspirational porn, and where you see, you know, there's videos over Twitter of blind people using their phone, and it's like, yes, blind people can use a phone. Actually, voiceover is great on Apple devices. Or when an ambulatory wheelchair user stands up and they're like, and people are like, oh, you've been cured, and it's like, no, it's just some people don't need a wheelchair full time, you know. So I'm rambling a bit, but I think there's a fine line between, yeah, sympathy and pity, and I think that's what you've got to be careful to avoid.
Okay, so Tom Smith, what makes you choose something as interactive rather than a narrative piece of theatre? What makes you choose something as interactive rather than a narrative piece of theatre? I'm not quite sure what you mean, Tom. Can you maybe just rephrase that?
Does you mean maybe interactive versus a traditional form of theatre?
Possibly. Is that what you mean, Tom? Yes.
I can talk a bit to this aspect, which is, I think, I don't think there is like it's about serving the particular story and what you want the audience to experience. And I think that you shouldn't take interaction lightly. It's not for every story. I feel like it's about what you feel the journey for that audience member is, and how you would like to deliver that storytelling as maybe an individual experience rather than a collective experience. Not that interaction doesn't have to be collective. I think that's quite interesting. It's about, and also I think you have to think about how much control you want over the storytelling in terms of the narrative and how it's displayed. So in traditional theatre, there is such an element of control in terms of the audience is nearly always facing forward. They're looking at the stage in the way that it's been very carefully set out, and people enter and leave at different points, that they're just sitting in a static position as an audience member watching this unfold. Whereas if something's interactive, as a creator or a creative on those projects, you have to be very aware that that person has some kind of agency in the world that you've created and is able to completely disregard something that you feel is quite important to the story. And I think that you have to kind of reconcile those ideas in your mind, in particular with the particular sort of story you want to make. That's all I'd say in terms of, from my perspective, the differences. But I know that people really study this, and it goes a lot in depth about what makes interaction and you know, what makes a narrative interactive and not. But from my perspective, that's what I think about when I'm devising a project.
Do you want to add anything, Anna? No, okay. Okay, so Robbie's asking you, Lucy, how did you account for extreme variations in the story caused by the agency you gave to the audience, especially related to narration?
Yes, this was a lot of heavy lifting on the part of the actor in the room. And this was that element which is outside of the digital element. It was the human element that enabled us to have that flexibility. I think that actually there are new developments in terms of AI and stuff that I think in headset experiences might eventually be able to have more of that kind of really interesting flexibility. But in terms of Traitor, audiences did all sorts of mad things in the room that we were doing. They would try and unlock a door that was nothing to do with the experience. I think people that have done escape rooms have sort of understood this kind of level of adventuring from the audience. But what was really helpful was we cast the role of Commander Harris as a sort of actor / facilitator. So we weren't, so for instance, I played Commander Harris briefly in Tribeca along with my colleague, and it was much more about that person being responsive in the room and having a conversation, being prepared with a backstory of who this person was as Commander Harris, where they worked, who their colleagues were, what their responsibilities were. And with that foundation, that person was then able to use that basis to sort of engage with sort of rogue questions or ideas that might have come up from the audience. And without that flexible mechanism, I don't think we would have been as successful. And it's a big responsibility, though, I will say, to put on that facilitator. So I wouldn't say that it was wholly successful in terms of longevity of the storytelling, but of the project. But yeah, that was how we did it.
It's almost like you've got to create that entire story world in order that you know how to respond as the narrator within that. If anyone asks you anything, you're in that space. You are that character.
You have no line. You have some set lines, but it's more about you improvising as that character, basically. Improvisation.
Okay, Sylvia Mantilla Wright, is the future consideration for storytellers then to consider various sensory outputs of their work, either visual, audio, tactile, for example, as narrative actors of the storytelling, so that the storytellers can be sure the story is conveyed as intended, or is conveyed to the audience, or conversely, to leave some of... Sorry, she hit enter too quickly. Okay, I'll do it again. Is a future consideration for storytellers then to consider various sensory outputs of their work, e.g. visual, audio, tactile, as narrative actors of the storytelling, so the storytellers can be sure the story is conveyed as intended, and is conveyed to your audience. Storytellers can be sure the story is conveyed as intended to the audience, or leaving most of the others to the audience for open interpretation. That wasn't a difficult one to say at all, Sylvia. Did you get that? Okay, Anna, do you want to start?
I think it's an interesting problem, and I think it depends on what the focus of the story is. So I think for some stories, it's absolutely no issue with letting the audience interpret themselves and to take themselves on their own journey and to take whatever message. But I think there is a responsibility for the writers and the creators when you're focusing a story around groups that are traditionally marginalized, or could be. And so I don't think there's a kind of one size fits all answer, but I think it's about being aware that people, particularly in immersive experiences, people will be comparing it to their own life experience, because that's what we do as humans. And that you can't guarantee what they're going to take away from it. So if you have something that you want them to take away from it, or something that you really don't want them to take away from it, then that's where you have to be really careful about how you approach it. If you're open for it to be more varied and to allow that to go in different ways, then it's not so much a problem. Sensory outputs are really interesting, though. I think that we can do a lot more with multisensory experiences, and I'm kind of looking into that at the moment, but it's a complex space. I think perhaps that answered your question, Sylvia. Maybe you can tell me later.
Did you want to add anything, Lucy?
No, that was really
succinct. No worries. Okay, Anna, what is the best type of narrative voice?
I don't think there is a best type. I think there's a worst type, and that's second person. Okay. It doesn't really work in fiction. The others, it just entirely depends on what you're trying to do. Sorry, that's not a very good answer, but like, I think what's interesting is not just assuming that it has to be first person, and looking at what that does in terms of the experience. So. Not just stumbling on it, but thinking quite carefully. And one of the things when you're, when you're a creative fiction writer, is that they really think about narrative voice and point of view and perspective. And they advise that you kind of think about that before you start writing, like figure this stuff out at the planning stage. So I think that's what's important.
Okay. And what for you, Lucy? What is the importance of having non-human characters as narrators?
Oh, I wouldn't say they're more or less important than anyone else. Yeah. I just think actually that's a question that sort of invites something to say that it's exciting to think about actually the type of character or perspective you might want to tell the story from. I think my point in Monoliths about the hair was about that sense that actually if you took away the human voice in that situation, that we gave the animal a different kind of voice, which was musical. So that it's a bit of a stretch, but it would still take you on a bit of a journey from environment to environment. And so I sort of wanted to say that the human voice isn't the only way of sort of conveying that storytelling from place to place, I suppose. And it was interesting in the creative process to talk about that score as a voice rather than the musical score. So that's sort of the inner workings of that intention. I'm not sure necessarily audiences would take that exactly away from it. But I think sort of giving voice to the perspective of all sorts of creatures and things is really exciting. So yeah, it's as important as you want to make it with your story, basically.
It's definitely harder to stereotype, isn't it, if it's like a rabbit or a hare or something. Okay. With the rapid development of XR and AI, do you believe the role of the narrator will ever become obsolete? Maybe the AI will just do it instead. It won't be obsolete, it'll just be done by somebody else or something else.
Yeah, I mean, could you not argue that the AI is then the narrator? Like,
I guess so, yeah.
So,
it becomes a non-human entity instead.
Yeah.
Okay. That was a rubbish question. Sorry, that was mine. We'll stick to Robbie's questions. These are much better than mine. Okay, I've got one more and then I'll stop. In what ways can narrators assist in the storytelling experience for those less able due to sound and vision impairments? So not wheelchairs, but actually, being able to see or hear.
Yeah.
That was for you, Maggie.
Yeah. I'm hearing impaired. So this was interesting to me because when you were talking about how it's portrayed in movies, and I was thinking of The Sound of Metal the whole time you were talking.
Oh, my favorite, and this again is film, but that's where a lot of my kind of examples come from. My favorite one to talk about is Coda, the child of deaf adults film that won loads of Oscars. Because I don't know how you feel about. Have you seen it, Maggie? I don't know.
I haven't seen Coda. Okay. I've seen Sound of Metal, and I didn't like it. But
okay, so just briefly, it's not about narration, but Child of Deaf Adults. It's literally a film about a hearing child of deaf adults. It's not a film about the deaf adults. The title is Child of Deaf Adults. So that's one thing. It's a film about music because all films about deafness involve music. What's really interesting about that, though, is that firstly, it was Oscar winning. It's got 3 deaf actors in it, which is great. But I use that as an example to say that we shouldn't be putting the responsibility of appropriate storytelling on actors, because their job is to be an actor, not to think about how deafness is represented. See a music, yeah, that's another one. So with Coda, it's really interesting if you look at the written critiques from deaf people and from Child of Deaf Adults, because they are completely different to the responses and the critical acclaim it got from hearing audiences.
That was the same with The Sound of Metal. I mean, it got all these awards at the end. I just hated it, and I felt so patronized by the end of it. And I was.
But it's being held up as a pinnacle of, like, this is an amazing Oscar-winning film, and like his acting was brilliant.
Yeah, it was great. Yeah.
And in Coda, there's one bit where he's having an argument with his daughter in Sign, and she's just ignoring him and blah 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 blah. And so, in order for her to accept what he's saying, he vocalizes. Yeah, right. So the point at which she listens to him is when he makes sound, and you're like, that's not what we're trying to do here. But yeah, so that's a recent one. Anyway, sorry, I get ranty. I'll stop being ranty. There are some good examples of disability representation. It's just that
it's great to hear, because so often, all we hear is like, some movie reviewers saying, oh, isn't this brilliant? They're showing all this, and as a sort of the person that, who's represented by this, it's like, no.
I also have OCD, and everyone's like, oh, your house must be clean, and I'm like, no, because that's not what OCD is. I wish. No, I don't wish, because actually, if you have the kind of cleaning compulsion, that's awful. Like, OCD is a horrible illness, and let's not be, all of those things, like, absolutely horrible. But no, my house is not clean.
Yep.
Because that's not actually what OCD is. Anyway, yeah, I'll stop, because I will stop.
No, Olivia's saying, no, don't stop. She's enjoying herself. Now, Catherine, have you got your hand up for a reason? Did you want to ask another question, or is it a mistake? Just check for a couple of seconds before we close. I know Robbie's come up with another question. Escape. Right, one last question while Catherine decides if she's just got a hand up or she wants to ask something, and then we will close. Is that okay, guys? Oh yeah, she's just touched something. That's fine. So when using VR, how did you get around nausea caused by virtual movement? Do you just avoid virtual movement altogether?
I've avoided virtual movement altogether because I think it's horrible and it makes people feel ill. So I think it limits your audience. And the biggest problem that when we're showcasing VR stuff is people go, the last time I did this, I felt really, really sick. And then it stops them from feeling like they want to do another experience. So I think it's all about testing it outside of just the people that are really familiar with the movement, making sure that you understand. And why are you zooming around in VR? Are you actually meant to be flying? Why are you teleporting from place to place? How does that serve the story, etc., etc.? I think you've got to be super conscious of it. And I think if you want to make your work accessible to a really wide range of people, there's something to be really carefully considered. We had a teleport option on Monoliths on one of the test versions, and we got rid of it quite quickly because there was a lot of danger of people feeling unwell, and that's just going to take away from the storytelling. So no.
Fair enough. I think we might have lost Anna. She's in her colleague's office, so I don't know if something's happened. Maybe someone hasn't paid the electric bill or something. Anyway, okay. Oh, Olivia's saying she's using teleportation in a VR project right now. Oh,
just test it. It might be fine. Just keep testing it with lots of people and seeing if anyone feels poorly. It might be absolutely fine.
Cool. Okay, I'm going to ask one more question from Robbie just to see if Anna comes back, and then we'll call it a day. Is that okay? Okay, so what if the perspective of the audience is in conflict with the narration provided? Hi, you're back.
Oh, she's gone.
That to me sounds
something
like
very odd is happening here. I think it's best if I disappear.
Okay, we'll finish one last question and then we'll go then, Anna. If you go before the end, thank you very much.
That was wonderful.
Okay, so just what if the perspective of the audience is in conflict with the narration provided?
That sounds like a great story. Tell me more. I don't know. I think that they can be in harmony or in conflict. That's all part of it. I don't know. That's all I'll say.
Okay, that's cool. That's fair enough. Okay, before Robbie comes up with another question, thank you very much, Robbie. I'm just joking. Your questions are brilliant, and also yours, Olivia. But I'm going to say a thank you to you guys because we've grilled you for quite a long time now, and Anna's got gremlins in our Zoom. So yeah, we're just going to say a big thank you to you guys for your time and your contribution and your presentations, which were as always amazing. So thanks very much, Lucy, and I'll tell Anna when she comes back. Thank you as well. The session's been recorded, as I said earlier, so if you want to tell your friends, if you were interested in this, please share the link. It's on northerndigifest.co.uk, and the session recordings tab's at the top, so have a look at that. I'd like to say thanks again to Sign, in case you missed the beginning. Screen Industries Growth Network funded this event, and so without them we couldn't run it, so thanks very much to those guys. And our next session this evening is around making a digital story without narration. So we're going to be joined by Professor Dominic Pousland, who is a professor of archaeology, is going to be talking about how they tell the stories of history without using a narrator. And we're also going to hear from Wayne Sables, who's an artistic director and producer from round Sheffield Way. He's going to talk about some of the work he's doing, and also Bethany Waitrose from Experience Heritage. Again, used to be an archaeologist and now uses technology to interpret and explain heritage in interesting ways. So that should be a good session later. So join us for that if you can. And if not live, it'll be on the recordings later. So anyway, that's us. Thanks very much, guys. Really appreciate your session. It was really interesting and insightful. And we'll see you again soon. Okay, take care. Thanks to you too, Catherine.